Hello, everybody, and welcome aboard. We're just getting ourselves started up here. So we've got Greg Pinn on the line. Greg, you can hear us?
I can. Can you hear me as well?
Perfect. Yeah. So this is Matthew Unger. I'm the CEO and founder of iComply Investor Services. Our focus as a company is to really help to make compliance easier and much more streamlined using the power of blockchain technology. And ironically, our focus as a company is for the blockchain industry. And how can we use how can we actually use this technology to make it easier and more efficient to be compliant, including right down to the point of what our core tech does, which is actually to put governance and compliance into tokens such as ERC20 tokens and allow them to trade within those restrictions. So today's webinar is going to be focused on very much on kind of the why behind compliance and what this means about how to build a compliance program and some of the high level things you need to focus on. We are going to have a couple of different things popping up, a couple polls and questions for you guys, as well as we do have some handouts for anyone who is on the call here. At the end, we have not only our research paper, which focused on cryptocurrency regulation and changes, as of, I guess it was published as of November last year. So there have been some updates since then. And then we also have a package focused around ICO issuers. If you are interested in learning more about the iComply platform, we can drop that there and you can take a look at it, or of course share it with anyone else you know that is interested. The core focus of today's presentation is, like I said, around building a compliance program, and who better to have that than Greg Pinn, who brings a wealth of experience. Greg started with a company called WorldCheck quite a few years ago. WorldCheck was acquired about 9 years ago by Thomson Reuters for a little over $500 million as the leading compliance AML solution in the industry. It still is the #1 AML suite of software. And we're very fortunate to have Greg actually come over to our side and help us to kind of build that next wave of compliance software that really can focus on some of the specific risks in the cryptocurrency market and how they pertain to your business, whether you are an ICO issuer, whether you are working at a cryptocurrency exchange or fintech platform, or even if you're just in the scenario of working with regulators or even compliance as a lawyer or an advisor, working with clients who are looking to launch an ICO or get into the cryptocurrency market in some way. I'm really hoping that today's session will give you a lot of value. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Greg, and we can get things going.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Matthew, thank you so much for that introduction. As Matthew said, I come to the space from a sort of lengthy amount of time, lengthy career in regulatory compliance in fiat, and now I've sort of migrated to the next interesting challenge for compliance, which is compliance in distributed ledger technology, blockchain, cryptocurrency. So it's a sort of very exciting place where we all are in this mode of how do we answer the compliance questions in 2018 with new technologies coming out around blockchain versus how this was done 20 years ago in fiat currency. Before we get going, why are you here? So Matthew has opened a poll for everyone. Give us a little bit of information about what are you trying to get from today. Why does this interest you? We'll give a sort of a minute for you all to answer the phone, and then we'll jump into exactly what we're trying to demonstrate and why compliance is so powerful.
Yeah, excellent. And we're just seeing a bunch of votes coming in right now. So definitely keep the poll running for a few more minutes. Looks like a couple people have not voted yet, but we do have quite a few votes coming in. We'll leave that open for a little bit more. And one of the things, just so everybody who is on the call is aware of, aside from at the end some of the handouts that we did mention, giving an overview of the iComply platform, as well as that, we're also going to have an Ask Me Anything. So if you do have questions that pop up, make a note of the slide or what have you, you can actually use the question function right in GoToWebinar and submit those questions, and we will open the floor up to those questions after the after we go through the core of the presentation, which shouldn't take too long. So just looking like we had almost getting close to 90% of the people who've now submitted a vote, and I think we'll cap the poll off now, and I'll let Greg get back to his presentation. Thank you.
So why does compliance matter? You know, we hear a lot, especially within blockchain and cryptocurrency in these industries. We hear that compliance is government overreach. It's governments expecting financial institutions to act like cops or like law enforcement, and that's really not what compliance is about. And so part of this presentation is to demystify and take a lot of that confusion out. But to start out, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of why compliance matters so much. In February 26, 1993, for those of you that are old enough to remember this, the World Trade Center was bombed. This obviously is not the 9/11 attack. The World Trade Center was bombed in the 90s as well. Ramzi Youssef drove a Ryder truck into the parking lot underneath the World Trade Center, blew it up, killed 6 people and injured over 1,000. When he was caught and he was being interrogated, and they were flying him in a helicopter, the FBI was flying him in a helicopter, and they happened to go over the site of the World Trade Center. And Bill Gavin, who was managing this investigation for the FBI, asked him, in a bit of a look, you failed, the building is still there. And his response was, well, it wouldn't be there if I hadn't run out of money. And this is exactly why compliance matters. The terrorist activities are expensive. Running criminal enterprises is expensive. And in the world that we live in today, the difficulty is not necessarily raising the money, but the difficulty is in moving the money where you need it. So if you're a member of Al-Qaeda or ISIS, raising money in the Middle East is relatively easy. Getting that money into the US or Canada or Europe to commit a terrorist attack, that's where the difficulty is. And what compliance is about is stopping the movement of funds that are related to illicit gains or criminal activities. Beyond that, human trafficking has become more and more of an issue globally over the last probably 50 years. Some estimates point to the fact that there are more people enslaved today than ever in the history of the world, just in raw numbers. And a lot of people think that human trafficking and human smuggling and sexual exploitation of women and children is a problem for third world countries, is a problem in Africa and Asia. And while that is very true, and more human trafficking happens in Africa and in certain parts of Southeast Asia than other parts of the world, even in the US and Canada, we see significant numbers of people into forced marriages, indentured servitude, and other forms of slavery, or whether that be sexual slavery or not. About over 70% of victims of human trafficking are female. In Canada, there are approximately 20,000 people are right now slaves in Canada, and over 400,000 people in the United States. This is a huge number of people. And obviously a lot of this, the movement of these people, the trafficking of these people is a huge law enforcement challenge that goes across many, many parts of law enforcement, whether that's FBI investigations, immigration and customs enforcement, border protection, as well as the movement of this money in the financial system. So now, one of the things that I think a lot of people think of when they think of compliance, regulatory compliance, and I mentioned this already, is terrorism. And people's usually gut response to that is, well, terrorism is incredibly rare. And while it's true, large terrorist attacks are very, very rare. Regulatory compliance is not simply about terrorism. Regulatory compliance is looking at any crime that is related to business or financial sectors or the movement of illicit funds. So this doesn't simply include terrorism, although terrorism is part of that, but drug trafficking, counterfeiting, bribery and corruption, which we'll talk about in a lot coming up, tax crimes, war crimes, money laundering, insider trading, trafficking in stolen goods, counterfeiting both goods and currency, kidnapping, piracy, so modern day piracy. And then you'll see sort of next to piracy at the right there, cybercrime, hacking, and phishing. And so already we've seen regulators starting to get involved in the cryptocurrency space. One of the challenges that we have as a community is that if you ask the average person on the street who has no knowledge of cryptocurrency, most likely they don't know what cryptocurrency is. So you say Bitcoin, and if their response is, oh, that thing you use to buy drugs. So most people, their initial idea of what is cryptocurrency came from things like the Silk Road. Or they hear things on the news about scams that happen around ICOs or scams that are happening with other companies. These cases in cryptocurrency are rare. They are very, very rare. We've seen a number of regulatory enforcement actions over the last few years, but it's still rare within the crypto space. But the fact that people have this impression about cryptocurrency is a huge hindrance to us as a community for people to get more engaged in the cryptocurrency space. And it's something that by engaging in this risk-based approach and ensuring that we are not enabling these sorts of activities, that ensures that we are able to fight back against the negative name that a lot of people associate with cryptocurrency because of those early cases with Silk Road. So we're going to take a pause for a second, another little quiz. So up on this screen are 8 terms related to regulatory compliance. And just to get a feel for your familiarity, how many of these terms are you all familiar with? So I'll go through them since Matthew's put up the poll. I'll read them out to you as well. KYC, AML, FATF, CFT, PEP, SAR, UBO, and EDD. So of those 8 terms, how many are you familiar with? And these terms are often guide the way that we look at AML and compliance. And I'm going to go through and explain what all of these things are. Like any industry, there are a lot of acronyms. Compliance has theirs. Obviously, cryptocurrency, this world has a whole lot of algorithms and key terms that you need to know. And so we'll make sure that we're focusing on understanding of all of these terms. So we'll give another few seconds for the answers, and then we'll sort of Matthew, if you can give us a good feel for what sort of answers we're getting, we can go in and discuss these in greater depth.
You bet. I'll actually, I think it'll be interesting for everyone to see the kind of the breakdown that we have across the board. Most of people have voted. I'm just going to give anyone who's on the call who might need another second or two just to click on that and see if we can get the last couple of votes in. But it looks like we've got quite a few people coming in here, so we'll give another 10 seconds. But I do think it is quite interesting to see the difference between the people that have experience with most of the terms versus the people that only have experience with a couple of the terms. And this is, I think, really brings us down to why this type of introductory piece and a high level piece on compliance is so important. So we've got those votes in here, and I'm just going to close but also share the results for people to get a bit of an understanding here. I think you can see that as well, Greg.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it looks like we've got a pretty even split here. So we've got about a third of the group is familiar with most of these terms. About a third are familiar with about half of them, and then a third are familiar with fewer than half. So it's definitely an interesting look. And I think for those of you that are familiar with all of them, hopefully we'll push forward here and you'll get a better understanding of how these things impact the work of AML specialists globally. And we'll dive in right now. So we start with this sort of ecosystem of compliance, and compliance obviously means a different thing depending on the industry that you're talking about. What we mean here is anti-money laundering compliance. It's also called KYC, know your customer. Sometimes called BSA, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute. So KYC, know your customer. KYC is the key piece of all of this, and KYC means understanding who it is you're doing business with. If you, for example, run an ice cream stand, you have no obligation to know who your clients are. There is no risk to your business in knowing if you're selling ice cream to someone sanctioned or a Iranian national. It's below the threshold of reasonableness. That is not the case when you work in financial services. Whether you're a bank, a broker dealer, an exchange, and more, that's becoming, if you work in those sorts of fields in cryptocurrency as well. So the type of currency is not necessarily what's important here, but it's the action that you are conducting. Know your customer is also starting to move into remote ID verification. As more and more businesses are looking to verify individuals who are not in front of them, there's greater and greater technologies that are coming up to fill that piece of know your customer. Of how do you demonstrate or how do you prove that someone is who they claim to be if they're not in front of you, for you to verify that they are the person, on their ID. And so KYC is a continually growing field. And what's so exciting about what's going on in KYC and in all of compliance in general is that there is a huge, huge boom in reg tech companies, regulatory technology companies. And that huge boom, we'll talk about this some more, but that huge boom in reg tech companies is making this a very exciting time to embrace and help grow the regulatory landscape. AML, anti-money laundering, AML is sort of the purpose in doing all of this. The purpose is to stop the movement of illicit funds. Money laundering is a term that a lot of people get thrown around. I think a lot of people are confused as to what money laundering actually is. And when you get down to it, it is sort of what's on the label. It is cleaning of money. And in this case, what that means is hiding the dirt that came with how the money was created. So if you sold narcotics for $1 million, you want to be able to use that $1 million without anyone being able to trace it back to the usage of narcotics. And that is what money laundering is. It is the movement of funds to hide the source of those illicit funds. And that's why people launder money. You can do it through real estate. You can do it through cars. You can do it obviously through the blockchain, through anonymous blockchains, Monero, Zcash, those sorts of things. You can use it. There are a number of cryptocurrency players who run mixing services, which is a way to hide the source of funds, which is a form of money laundering. There was one initially, I'm not sure if it's still open, that was simply called bit laundry. So they were being very apparent that that's what it was doing. And so money laundering is about hiding the source of funds for someone who's trying to uncover where that money came from. CFT, countering the financing of terrorism. This term came a lot in the early 2000s after the 9/11 attacks, when AML regulations really started to grow, and the compliance for those regulations and the requirements were growing as well. And this is a piece of AML, but as I mentioned before, it's the part that gets a lot of press and attention. It's not the part day to day that is the work of people that work in KYC and AML. PEP screening, politically exposed persons. One of the crimes that I listed and the risks that I listed before was bribery and corruption. One key part of KYC and AML is making sure that money is not being used to either bribe or corrupt political officials. Anyone who holds significant political office has the risk of being corrupted. And so it is beholden to financial institutions to make sure that that doesn't happen. And the reason for that is, again, it's not that financial institutions are acting as police, but rather they have the information to provide to law enforcement when something doesn't seem right. So while people may argue that it's your money, you can do with it what you will, the reality is that there are laws as to what money can be transferred to what people for what purposes. And part of those laws are to mitigate the risk of global corruption and bribery. UBO, ultimate beneficial ownership. UBO has become more and more of a hot topic in the last last 24 months or so, 24 to 36 months. And UBO is understanding what individual ultimately benefits from the profitability of a company. And this really gets from a screening perspective and from understanding who you're doing business with. Historically, all that a financial institution needed to know was the company that they were doing business with, not necessarily who in that company was going to gain or lose from it. And as more and more shell corporations and other types of LLCs and other types of corporate organizations, were structured, it became more and more important to be able to identify the actual people responsible. And this became significantly more important as the U.S. government passed sanctions against Russia over the annexation of Crimea. And those sanctions required people to understand what the ownership was the ownership percentages and the ownership structure for a lot of different companies, major companies in Russia. And so UBO requires financial institutions to ensure that they're screening all individuals who own, and most legislation says 25% or more of a company. That could be as low as 10% in certain cases. So understanding who owns the company, so the actual ownership of 25% or more, as well as all of the key principals. Those are going to be your C-level executives and anyone who would be considered an insider for insider trading laws, so people that have intimate knowledge of the finances of a company. And finally, to finish up the circle is EDD, Enhanced Due Diligence. EDD is the next step beyond simply anti-money laundering and know your customer. The next level is enhanced due diligence. And this is when the value of a deal or the risk of the deal is great enough that you need to do additional scrutiny. So let's say you're launching an ICO, there's someone that you don't know has come in and wants to purchase 10% of your company, 10% of your tokens. You are going to want to make sure that you know what is the risk of this person who is investing so significantly in my company. And so that's when a simple AML or KYC check is not going to be sufficient, and you're going to need to expand that to a full EDD check. And that's going to go in and do source of wealth information. That's going to look at corporate structures. What boards is this person on? Do they live where they say they live? The address provided real? Do they live in the address that's provided? It's a very, very detailed view of information on individual and entity. And that becomes hugely important when you're talking about large amounts of money or large risk to your business. So moving on from sort of the key acronyms in this area to some of the driving forces here. So I want to start out with BSA, the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970. The BSA is where regulatory compliance originated. All of these laws sort of started with the BSA. It's a U.S. law, and one of the things that you'll see with laws within regulatory compliance is that the U.S. has led the way in a lot of this legislation, and that legislation has then moved across the globe into Canada, the EU, the UK, Australia, Switzerland, all over the globe, each country taking their own tact at it, and then coming together to seeing where things are the same and where things are different. There is not a unified approach to this legislation globally. Each country has their own policies, and we'll talk about some of that in a moment. So the BSA is the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970. From when the BSA was made into law, was signed into law, excuse me, until 2001, the levels of fines were incredibly small. The enforcement was very light. The fines were not even, I mean, it wouldn't even have, it was in the noise for a company. They were never a big deal. This was just something that, sort of went on. And a lot of that had to do with what technology was available, but there just wasn't a huge push for regulatory compliance before 9/11. In 9/11, the USA PATRIOT Act was signed. After 9/11, I should say, the USA PATRIOT Act was signed. Section 3 of the USA PATRIOT Act, Title 3 of the USA PATRIOT Act is all about how to prevent money laundering and the financing of terrorism. And starting with the USA PATRIOT Act is when compliance really started to become a much, much bigger deal for financial institutions. This is when organizations started having to significantly grow their their compliance departments and become much, much more engaged in how they deal with onboarding customers and how they identify risk of their customers. It's at that point that we started seeing fines going from where it had been in the thousands and hundred thousands of dollars to the early 2000s when it was in the low millions of dollars to where we are today, where we had HSBC a couple of years ago fined billions of dollars. We've seen a handful of these multi-billion-dollar fines for egregious violations of AML and KYC rules. And so, in the case of HSBC, if you haven't seen it, there's some documentaries on what exactly HSBC did. But for those fines, it's egregious. And I think it's worth sort of, since we're discussing fines, demystifying something that a lot of people believe about the regulators. A lot of people within this industry have this belief that the SEC and the OCC and FINRA and FINTRAC, all of these regulatory authorities are looking to make money off of non-compliance, that they're looking to shut people down, they're looking to fine people, and that's simply not how these organizations work. Their goal is for companies, for financial institutions to be compliant. And to that end, if your organization is using reputable vendors, is making a detailed risk-based approach to onboarding your customers that's aligned with best practices, the regulator is not going to come to you and issue you a cease and desist order or issue you a fine. They may come to you and say, hey, listen, you're out of compliance, you need to go and do these things. And they'll work with you on setting up a plan as to how to get to that point. Where do you need to be? What are you deficient in? And how do you get out of being deficient? The regulator is looking for compliance. They're not looking to fine and to shut people down. And I think that's a big misnomer in this industry, is that the regulator's out to get you. They're not. They're out to get you to be compliant. So moving on from the USA PATRIOT Act, was something called the MLD, the Money Laundering Directive. The fourth EU Money Laundering Directive went into effect this year. The fifth EU Money Laundering Directive was announced in April. So as the fourth EU Money Laundering Directive went into effect last year. So as the fourth EU Money Laundering Directive went into effect, they were already working on the fifth one. And what's so interesting about the fifth EU Money Laundering Directive is it is the first main international piece of legislation that speaks about the compliance requirements of cryptocurrencies. So the fifth EU Money Laundering Directive specifically calls out cryptocurrency exchanges and requires that they have the same processes in place as normal exchanges and broker-dealers and financial institutions have. And so we can see this growth of requirements for cryptocurrency businesses as it's becoming more and more mainstream. We've seen this as well from the SEC, from the OCC, from the CFTC. All of them have come out and said, you know, whether it's crypto or fiat, it's the function that matters, not the form.
I think one of the things on that point, Greg, is you know, you mentioned as an example the exchanges, but I recall in that order, you know, people that are registered as marketplaces, money services businesses, et cetera. So even if you're doing something to the effect of exchanging fiat to crypto, or even just doing crypto transactions with EU investors, it's still impacting you. And one of the things, you know, just for our listeners there to bear in mind is that, you know, these terms as they relate to different jurisdictions, in some cases, you know, they apply across an entire, you know, multiple countries, but in most cases, the actual regulations vary by jurisdiction as well.
Yeah, that's completely true. And understanding where jurisdictions start and end can be very complicated. So what laws are national, what are multinational, and what are supranational? So if you look at GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which sort of governs, basically it's the right to be forgotten legislation in the EU, that has supranational impact. If you don't forget, quote unquote, the information about a EU citizen, even if you have nothing to do with the EU can come and get you. They can issue you fines, they can issue subpoenas. Obviously your government would have to comply, but those things have impact globally. And so understanding where one of these starts and ends can be complicated. Moving on to FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. This is another US law that basically says that you cannot try to corrupt foreign political officials. This is very complicated in the US because of how the movement of money to US politicians works. But foreign politicians are a different world for as the US government is concerned. And so the FCPA really has a lot to do with how products are sold across the world. Where the old way used to be that you'd slip, you know, a few $100,000 or a few $1 million to some sort of political figure in a foreign country, and that would get sort of grease the wheels. The FCPA came out and said, no, that is not allowed anymore. And there are a number of fines that have been issued against companies for going against the FCPA. Moving on, OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control. OFAC is the largest and most significant sanctioned body in the world. It's part of the US Department of the Treasury. Again, it stands for the Office of Foreign Asset Control. OFAC lists between 6,000 and 7,000 individuals and entities at a time. That number fluctuates as different sanctions increase and decrease. So yesterday, the US government announced that it's reissuing sanctions against Iran. And so the number of individuals that are going to be sanctioned because of the repeal of the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal, the number of individuals and entities that will be sanctioned are going to now go up in the next few weeks. One thing to note about OFAC, in general, OFAC is about 2/3 drug traffickers and about 1/3 terrorists. These are the very, very highest ranking drug traffickers and terrorists globally. This is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. This is El Chapo. These are the sort of brand name terrorists and narcotics trafficking groups. These are not the low-level people. And frankly, these are not the people that really pose risk to the financial markets, because these people use underlings and associates to do that sort of work. They are not the ones that do the money laundering directly. And so often looking at simply at OFAC is just not enough for most businesses. FinCEN is the U.S. Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. FinCEN is how data gets submitted to the government how data gets submitted to the government by financial institutions about risk. And we'll talk about how those are submitted in a moment. But these things are submitted by financial institutions to the U.S. government. And the U.S. government uses FinCEN as a clearinghouse for law enforcement. And so this is where law enforcement can come to get leads on potential crime. This is where law enforcement can work together to enhance existing investigations and bring in the financial components of ongoing investigations. FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, this is an intergovernmental agency globally. This FATF sets guidelines globally for for regulations specifically around things like what sort of crimes and risks matter. So the list of crimes I showed you before, that comes from FATF, as well as defining what is a PEP. Where this becomes complicated is that FATF is not a treaty and it doesn't have the presence of international law. Because of that, FATF is simply a place for countries to get together and discuss best practices. Each country then implements their own regulations slightly differently. And for PEP screening, this becomes very, very complicated. You've got countries like Mexico who don't just consider PEPs anyone in public office, but they consider candidates for public office PEP. Canada considers any local city or town leader, regardless of the size of the city or town, to be a PEP, whereas the generally accepted rule is cities and towns with 100,000 people or more. And so the rules fluctuate from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So it becomes incredibly important when you're looking at how you screen sanctions and PEP and all of this stuff to make sure that you're pulling this data from a vendor that understands what they're doing, what they're talking about. And finally, just the last component is a SAR, Suspicious Activity Report. This is every time a suspicious individual or entity tries to open an account with a financial institution or commits a suspicious act, suspicious activity. There are over 2 million of these are submitted by financial institutions to the U.S. government every single year. You may all remember Dennis Hastert, the former Speaker of the House. Dennis Hastert he eventually went to jail, not for what he did, which was molest children, but he actually went to jail for what's called structuring, which is trying to avoid transaction monitoring rules globally. So we talk about screening. One of the things that's critically important is understanding a risk-based approach. A risk-based approach means you need to screen those things that are important for your business and for the scope of your business. If you're running a small financial institution in northern Manitoba and all of your clients are local individuals, your level of risk is far below it than Citibank or Bank of America or Barclays. And so you need to make sure that you're screening based on the size and scope of your business. And so what we look at is sanction screening, a little bit more being regulatory enforcement and law enforcement screening. We then look at PEPs, political screening, and finally high-risk individuals and entities. And that's really the place where we find all of the individuals and players that pose the greatest risk. Again, each organization has to determine the level of risk for their business based on the client base they have and the types of products they offer. While sanctions lists, most sanction lists can be pulled directly from source, not all of them can, but most can. But you really need a good data vendor to make sure that you're screening PEPs and high-risk individuals and entities properly. You need to understand the type of data you're getting from your vendor. And you need to make sure that that data meets the needs of your business. And finally, I know I sound like a broken record about this, but you have to take a risk-based approach. You need to look at what is the risk of the types of customers you're onboarding, and then understanding, based on the types of customers you're onboarding, how much screening and how much AML do you need to perform. Finally, let's talk about geographic risk. And I think this is an area as well that gets a lot of heat from people who think that there's a lot of risk in doing this sort of screening. Geographic risk is understanding that certain jurisdictions are doing business with individuals and entities in certain jurisdictions are higher risk than others. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do business with those jurisdictions, but it does mean you need to understand the risk there. So if you're looking at countries that have a higher prevalence of human trafficking, for example, you're going to want to make sure you understand what is the source of wealth for these individuals. Is the money relevant to the type of individual and the type of risk associated with that person? Asking those detailed questions, ensuring that you understand risks about IDs and how you verify an individual's ID that may be in a country that has very low sophistication on the types of IDs they have to offer. So geopolitical risk can help balance your screening efforts. And a lot of companies make determinations that they just don't want to do business with high-risk countries. That's something that every company and every organization needs to decide for themselves. Obviously, it's a double-edged sword. By opening it up to more institutions, you're opening up your market and you're opening up more opportunity. You're also inserting risk.
And one of the very interesting things about this that we see specifically in the cryptocurrency space is, one, from this risk-based approach, we've seen some governments, the Attorney General of New York or the head of the financial regulators in Japan, really start looking at things like the exchanges, the marketplaces, and less the ICOs and more the platforms, to look at them and say, like, what are your procedures like, and how are you doing this? Specifically things like a risk-based approach. You mentioned the concept of people associating Bitcoin with money laundering, and we're starting to get some questions from people here. So please do submit some questions. We will get to those very shortly and for the next couple of slides here. So if you do have a question, pop that in. But one of the things that you just, that I thought of here as you're going through this, Greg, is this perspective that, the risk-based approach really depends on who your clients are. And because whether it's true or not, with things like blockchain forensics, which is a tool we have built right into iComply's solution, with things like blockchain forensics, we can actually make a very seamless step from one layer of screening into a much more enhanced layer of screening. But the interesting thing that we see is a lot of the issuers or the exchanges or platforms that are out there, they're kind of have a blind side to the fact that cryptocurrency is, whether forensic data tells us what percentage of cryptocurrency, or let's say Bitcoin, is not being, is not dark transaction, is not being used for money laundering. We know that it's actually a very small percentage, even compared to things like fiat currencies. But the issue is because it's an open public ledger, it's so transparent and easy to find out after the fact, that it's actually very important for issuers when they're looking at that to understand that regulators will view them as being more risky simply because they're in the cryptocurrency space.
Thank you, Matthew. So looking forward, what do we do here? As an industry, as people that are engaged in cryptocurrency, that want to see cryptocurrency grow and be successful, what do we do? And the future from a compliance perspective is actually a really exciting time. If we look at costs right now, about 60% of compliant costs are related to personnel costs. That's the cost of going through and saying, yes, a hit, no, a hit, no, a hit, yes, a hit. It's the cost of training those people. It's the cost of all of the human effort. and that's enormous. And then we see about 20% of costs being related to data and 20% of costs being related to software. Where things stand right now is that we're seeing a huge growth in RegTech companies, which aligns very, very powerfully with this huge growth in fintech and cryptocurrency. And the great thing about that is we're in a position to learn from 40 plus years of fiat institutions growing organically their compliance platforms. We as a cryptocurrency industry can come in and say, okay, those things don't work, or those things don't work well enough, or we know how we can do it better. We're not locked into the way that things have been done in the past. The results need to be the same, but how we get there in a way that's cost effective, in a way that reduces barriers for entry for individuals, regardless of what platform they're using or what country they come from, is hugely, hugely powerful. And as we're able to, through these technologies, as we're able to reduce the cost of this whole process, we can then focus our efforts more closely. We can ensure, and we can be on the front line of mitigating risk associated with human trafficking, with narcotics trafficking, with illegal arms sales, with bribery and corruption. And instead of being an industry that is looked upon as sort of a black sheep of compliance, we can lead the way in how we ensure that innocent people, that people who are using the system for completely innocuous things, that we reduce the bar to entry for them, while still ensuring that this industry, that this marketplace is not a marketplace for high-risk activities. Thank you very, very much for your time. We'll open it up to some questions that Matthew, if you can lead the way there, and we'll just take this as long as there are questions to answer.
Perfect. Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that, Greg, for going over that and kind of relating some of that stuff back to our industry here. I guess we've got a couple questions coming in, and actually one was specifically a comment about the beginning of your presentation. One of our members in the audience actually just submitted a comment to say that nine friends of theirs, I guess they work in New York, but 9 of their friends actually passed away in that 9/11 attack. That that we know so much was linked around this. So it definitely can hit home for people, no matter what industry you're in. The impacts of the flow of money can have a big impact on everybody. One of the questions I have here was, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, we obviously, I mean, that's heartbreaking. We saw that a lot, obviously, 9/11. And what we've seen in the years since then is governments globally working better together, not working perfectly. There's a lot of room to grow, but working better at sharing this information. It was a huge lesson that was learned after the Paris and Brussels attacks as well, is how governments, not only how do we need to share information within the government, that's what FinCEN does, but how do we do it intergovernmentally, where governments, the government in Turkey can alert the government of France about a suspected terrorist moving across Europe. And that information sharing is becoming more and more critical because these individuals, these crimes don't stay in one place. And we have to be able to leverage intelligence from one jurisdiction to another.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And so I've got a couple more questions here. And so I think maybe we'll start with the first one here, and it's actually referring to some of the major hacks. I think one of the headliners from this year was the NEM hack in I believe it was out of Japan, but there was over $500 million stolen, if I recall correctly. And interestingly enough, using the forensic software, you can actually track the wallets that it goes through. And we know that it's currently sitting in approximately 4 different wallets actually in Canada. And so this is definitely something that we see a lot more of. But the question specifically around these hacks is, with these hacks that we've seen in 2018, do we see this affecting the ICO market and impacting, will we see more stability and security with increased adoption?
Yeah, I think we absolutely will. There's a whole, the compliance that we've been talking about today is this anti-money laundering, KYC compliance. There's an entire other world of banking compliance around security. So what processes, what firewalls, what tools, and what are best practices for securing a financial institution. It is incredibly rare for us to see hacks happen with fiat financial institutions. It's not rare for us to see in cryptocurrency. I think a lot of the reason for that is a lot of these companies, look at Binance, the largest exchange. Binance a year ago had a handful of employees. This year they said that they may make as much as $1 billion in revenue. And so that fast growth just does not allow for these companies to stop and say, okay, well, how do we deal with IT security like we are a real bank? And we saw this in the dot-com era as well. PayPal had a huge issue with this in the early 2000s, where they were behaving like a bank, but they were assuring everyone they were not a bank, but a technology company. And eventually the regulators came down and said, no, you're a bank. And that's what we're going to see here as well, is that technology compliance is going to play a much, much larger role. And we'll see, I very much believe we'll see those hacks really, really decline over the next few years.
Yeah, and thank you. And you know, it's interesting, the point of you know, somebody along the lines of PayPal coming into the market and saying, no, we're not a bank, we're not a bank. And you know, you only have to look at you know, Coinbase's move towards becoming a regulated exchange, or Robinhood applying for a banking license, to see that this is a trend that we see continuing as regulators come down, like last year in July, when the SEC said, no, the DAO was a security, and if you meet these requirements, you know, you do invoke securities regulation. And I think one of the things that's really important, just for the people on the call here, is to understand that, you know, when you're dealing with people's money and verifying people's identity with KYC, you unlock not just things like the Howey test, but you know, you're invoking everything potentially from exchange regulation to securities regulation to identity to privacy, and then of course the KYC and AML and the acronym soup that you saw earlier in the presentation. One of the questions that we have coming in from Dimitri specifically is more focused on iComply as a company, but in what way? And so I'd love to take a stab at this as well, but I think Greg, you've got some good insights here. But in what way does iComply set itself aside from the vast competition in the market? Obviously, there's a lot of people that profess to do KYC and digital identity, but how do we separate the legitimate software solutions or tools out there from the ones that just aren't meeting these standards?
You know, I think that was why I personally came over from fiat compliance to crypto compliance. Cryptocurrency has been something that I've been interested in for a number of years, and I saw that deficit. You know, you can see over the last year how, you know, even the major players, Binance, Coinbase, Gemini, Kraken, all of them have been pushing slowly towards better compliance. But a lot of the sort of startup players that are filling that space are providing overly cheap, overly simplified versions. And I think the real question that you need to ask, that hopefully this has armed you with, is what questions, as a customer, what questions do you need to ask? You know, are they providing you PEP screening? How do they certify and validate the individuals that they're screening against? And then looking at this not just from a single point, but looking at it from multiple angles. So because this is cryptocurrency, we don't just care about an individual, but we care about their digital footprint as well. So are they doing things like wallet forensics and wallet investigations? And those sorts of things become very important as well.
Definitely. And I think, you know, on this point, one of the things that's very interesting, and we had this pop up in a conversation recently, was, you know, these specifically in the world of exchanges. And I know we've got several, exchange owners or people involved in managing exchanges on the call here. And you know, specifically in that scenario, they're looking at something like what I would refer to as a digital onboarding tool. And so when you see some of the leading KYC, quote unquote, I'll call them light KYC providers on the market, you see, if you actually do some digging into what they do, it's really just a camera phone app and a dashboard on the back end. And all they're really doing is, here's a selfie and here's a copy of your identity documentation. And the interesting thing is that doesn't, that in many jurisdictions, that doesn't even meet identity regulation, much less things like KYC. And so it's important to really get to dig down. And the second, I think, Greg, you can maybe speak to this from experience, but the second that someone says that they're calling the PEP database as their form of PEP screening, immediately should be a bit of a flag. If somebody's saying like, yeah, we're screening every person in the world who's at any layer of government by the definition of those government, that database just does not exist.
I think that's a key point, is understand there are only a handful of companies globally that create their own data. You can count them on one hand. And so you need to understand where is the data actually coming from. And we've had lots of conversations with vendors who say things like, we have the PEP list or we have the sanctions list. It's like, well, there isn't one sanction list. There are, depending on how you count, hundreds of them. And so what exactly are you pulling in? And just asking those questions and seeing how they respond and what sort of confidence they respond with, I think, can often give you the information you need as to, is this a vendor that you really want to do business with or not?
And the other thing, I think, it's, specifically because the question did ask for iComply, so I'll take the opportunity to chime in specifically from us. But one of the things that we've worked on and even filed patent applications for was the specific ability to have your KYC onboarding change by jurisdiction, so that anywhere out of 160 countries in the world, you can actually go and make sure that the user is going through an onboarding piece. And that is something that we've been working on to really streamline, because the way it's done now, whether you use our system or whether you use other systems, if you go and configure your rules for Canada, which is where we're based, let's say, that KYC regulation in Canada is not the same as the US. And in fact, if you do the KYC standards for Canada and you take on a US investor, you're offside. And same thing vice versa. If you do KYC standards in the US, you're actually not complying with Canadian regulation. And these regulations are governed on a country by country basis. So one of the big things that we are really working towards is having a tool that enables your platform to take on investors from all over the world, because this is we are in a global marketplace, and especially with decentralized finance. We really have to ease some of these burdens on the front lines of it being able to accept these different people, and not have to subject everybody in the world to, let's say, German regulatory requirements of a video interview and all these different things. Those have to be managed in a way where you're meeting the criteria of the different jurisdictions, and then you can raise the bar based on the risk of that you may see with that. We've got a bunch more questions coming in here, so I'm going to quickly jump off to the next one.
Rapid fire.
Rapid fire here. So this one's actually quite interesting, from Sharif, and he's asking specifically around what about if you're running an exchange and the customers using your exchange are actually in countries where cryptocurrency is still illegal or not allowed, which is from a compliance perspective kind of opens a whole bunch of can of worms. And one of the things I will say about this, just to help to define the scope of the question, is there's actually very few jurisdictions where cryptocurrency exchange is actually illegal. There's a lot of misunderstanding about. Oftentimes, it's literally having proper compliance that's the missing piece. It has nothing to do with cryptocurrency, and we've seen that in our own meetings with the SEC and demoing our software to different regulators around the world. We've met with most of the regulators and monetary authorities in the G20 countries, given them demos, and one of the common misconceptions that people in the cryptocurrency world have is that somehow regulators are against blockchain or distributed ledger technology, when in fact they don't care what type of database that you use. They care that you document and process transactions according to the rules. And so within that scope of the question specifically here, I can think of as an example a country where cryptocurrency exchange is still legal is China, which is a huge part of the global population. So in regards to those sort of procedures, I don't know if you want to chime in on this, Greg.
Yeah, I mean,
but
I think the best advice is to tread a little bit carefully, and to find, because these legislation, South Korea is a great example where we've seen legislation change, continuously. And so really what you need to do is find yourself a good cryptocurrency attorney who can guide you on what are the constantly changing regulations globally. This is an area where you want to play it safe. You want to make sure that you're not putting your business at risk. And so I would say, because these things are changing constantly, I highly recommend that you consult an attorney that specializes in cryptocurrency.
Yeah. Okay. So the next one, thank you. The next one is from Sander, who's asking about specifically, we mentioned GDPR briefly, and maybe I can take this one specifically, having spent quite a bit of time in Europe around this topic, is basically, what about in the world of GDPR, where with blockchain, the data is principally being stored forever. The right to be forgotten doesn't really fit. And I think that's that's a really good question. The answer to that is, you better be very sure that how you're structuring your blockchain, you're not storing personal information on that blockchain. Any sort of PII being stored on a blockchain, and there's KYC providers that do on-chain a KYC solution. So like, KYC and everybody's information is logged on Ethereum. GDPR is a minimum $20 million fine per infraction, so per person. And you just have to do a bit of Google searching to find out some of the vendors, and they're even big names in the cryptocurrency space that are doing this with no way of actually remediating or righting the wrong. So our perspective, that really comes down to the architecture of the technology. What information do you make immutable? What information are you storing permanently, versus what information might you need a hash or some other sort of salting of the data to make sure that we're not actually logging information that's subject to GDPR in a scenario like on a blockchain, specifically a permanent public blockchain. The next question comes from Yuri, specifically looking at security tokens in the US. And we didn't actually mention this, but iComply and our customer base, currently we focus very much on cryptocurrency exchanges, crypto launch platforms, including security token platforms, and then the ICO issuers themselves. The focus of our two products really cover two workflows: one, the onboarding of customers, and two, the processing and documentation of transactions. So the question here from Yuri says, briefly, what compliance requirements should be met when issuing a security token in the US and or internationally? So that's not briefly, because that gets more complex. but then specifically, what does iComply provide? Is this full outsourcing of compliance? Does it cover accreditation of investors? And what about secondary trading of security tokens? So it sounds like a fairly comprehensive question.
Yeah,
here.
Let me try. I'll try to rapid fire as much as I can on this one. It sounds like, because you mentioned accredited investors, that you sort of know the big risk here. For those of you that aren't aware what accredited investors are, there is a law in the U.S. that says that if you're going to invest in a non-listed company, in a non-public offering, you have to be what's called accredited, which basically means you have to meet certain income and net worth requirements in order to participate. And ICOs fall into that space. And so your question of, well, how does this all work with regulation is very complex. And that's where iComply can help you in deciding exactly how you want to launch your ICO. There's jurisdictional questions about what jurisdiction you want to launch in. There are questions about what kind of SEC exemptions you need, or you may want to have based on the type of your business. If this is outside of the US, there are other exemptions, other legal framework that you need to comply with. And these are things that iComply ICO is here to enable those things. Our platform allows for both approval of transactions for both primary issuance and secondary trading, which is another question you asked. And what's so critical about that is that you as the issuer, you as the offering issuer, are always in control over who owns equity in your business. So whether it's a primary trade or a secondary trade, you always have control over approval and rejection of those trades. And that's hugely, hugely important. You want to make sure that you always, and we have tools that allow you to auto-approve or auto-reject trades, but you're going to want to do that manually at certain points. If someone's buying a significant share, if it's being sold to a specific jurisdiction, where you're going to want to maybe do either enhanced due diligence or at least observe the trade before it happens. And so all of those things are what iComply brings to the table. Basically, what we are is a company that facilitates the process of issuing your ICO so that you can go and innovate. Your business is not launching, and well, some of your business probably is, but for most of you, your business is innovating new products, new services, exciting new dApps, all of those things that make this ecosystem so exciting. Our business is ensuring that you can do that effectively without needing to worry as much about all of these compliance details. You know, we have rules engines built in that understand and know the rules of different jurisdictions and what it means to accept investment from certain parts of the world. All of those rules are built into our platform so that you don't have to go and worry about all those things. We do the worrying for you.
Yeah, excellent. And I think one of the, you know, to that point, the question around, you know, what specifically do you need? If you're issuing only to US investors, it's a lot more straightforward. You know, you only have to do US KYC, US accredited investors, and then worry about the US regulations. The second you go into other jurisdictions, you now need to make sure that you're following those KYC procedures and those securities procedures. So in Canada, you actually have to file, you know, as an example, if we were to do a raise in Canada, we would file most likely an offering memorandum. And then in the US, we might do a Reg D or a Reg A plus. But those, in order to access investors from any jurisdiction, you actually need to follow the rules of that jurisdiction. So that is very much the core of what we've focused on with iComply. If somebody is interested in looking at what our product does, you know, from an ICO issuer perspective, because that's the question, the perspective of this question. Basically, once you sign up, you can invite your team, invite your legal, your compliance officers, whoever you have on your operations or technical team into the system, configure your offering. We have contracts, ERC20 standardized contracts for crowd sale, whitelisting, and compliant tokens for both security and equity tokens that allow for, you can have them open and freely traded traditional ERC20 token, or they could be more structured and restricted security tokens that actually have lockup periods and other stuff like that built in. So anybody who is interested, that is actually just part of what we offer to our clients. And then of course, the customer identification program and the steps of going through that first step when somebody comes to your website and says, I'm interested in investing, right down to the point of documenting that transaction. That entire workflow is built into our system. And the goal of our system in the long run is that this is something that we want any tier one bank that wants to start engaging in cryptocurrencies would actually be able to use this solution for end-to-end compliance, not having to buy 9 different pieces of software just to cover compliance in one country, which is the way that the ones who are trying to do the higher standards, what they're actually doing. And we see a lot of this happening. We do have a couple different people that have just submitted a couple quick questions, and I did see one of them specifically was in regards to the research paper, and there should be some handouts that you can access. If for whatever reason you cannot access the research paper, the customer identification program, which covers how iComply does screening today, and then if you want to know kind of what's next on our roadmap, you do feel free to reach out. And then finally, the last piece is our ICO issuer package, which covers some of what's available to you today as an ICO issuer. We do have specific pieces available for exchanges, token launch platforms, etc. So you can always reach out to us if you have further questions on that. But looking at the time here, we are now a little over everyone's 1 hour time frame. So I do want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us to go through this. And if you do have any follow-up questions, by all means, do reach out. We will send you a little follow-up email. So feel free to respond to that if need be. But other than that, thank you very much. And we're definitely looking forward to speaking with you again.